Henri Muurimaa, and it's really nice to see so many people here who came here instead of the sushi workshop. That's probably where I was if I was not giving the presentation. And as you probably noticed, I'm not actually speaking French, and my accent in English is atrocious, so this is for the reason that I'm actually from Finland. And I tried to actually find out something interesting to say about Finland to kick things off, and I found this kind of a graph. Has anyone any idea what the heat map is about?
Coffee consumption.
Excuse me?
Coffee consumption.
Coffee consumption, really good bet.
Beer consumption.
What? One kind of
heavy metal groups.
Yes, number of metal bands per capita. And we are winning, yes, we're the best in the world. And the rest of the Nordics are doing pretty well as well. And not quite surprising considering that headbanging is a really good way to stay warm in the winter. Okay, I'm not going to talk more about musical preferences. Instead, today I'm going to tell you about Vaadin. How many of you guys actually know Vaadin is or actually have tried to use it? A couple of hands. Are you guys users or not? Who's using Vaadin? Nobody yet, but let's change that. I'm going to start with intro to Vaadin, and the other part of the presentation is about how to apply functional techniques, building user interfaces of Vaadin, and also reactive part. I'm going to actually go into quite start from the beginning. So if there's somebody who's really a guru using functional stuff already, they might be a bit bored about that part. But hopefully, when I apply those principles in UI development, that's going to be something new. Please ask questions, raise your hand, interrupt me, that's fine. We can take any questions during the presentation. We have time for that in the end as well. And before we get going, last thing, I'm going to make one claim during the presentation, and some of you guys might actually find the claim a bit controversial, so let's see. Right, so Vaadin, what Vaadin is about? What the company is all about making you guys better at building kick-ass user interfaces. And what it's all about UI components. Our products offer you a set of your components that are really easy to use. They have lots of features, and at least I think they are pretty nice looking on box as well. And currently, these UI components come in two different iterations. What I'm going to talk today about is the Vaadin framework, which is a server-side tool for building nice web UIs for a Java application for Java developers. This means that Java devs do not actually need to learn HTML and JavaScript if they don't want to. And why? Well, choosing a technology is always about compromise. If you are choosing, let's say, a client-side technology, some HTML templates, and you write a UI logic in JavaScript that's executed in the browser, you're optimizing user experience. I mean, every interaction is usually quite smooth, and latencies are really slow because everything is happening really close to the user. But the compromise is that you actually have to sprinkle your logic in different places. There's the UI logic in JavaScript itself, but also almost all applications need to do something on the server side, database stuff or something like that. So you need to do that as well. And well, you might be using Node.js, but still many times it's actually a different language from what you're actually using for developing the UI. And we also might consider the RPC layer that actually lets those two paths talk together with each other. That might be actually a third different path to actually do stuff to actually make the UI happen. And one is a bit different. I'm going to explain briefly in a minute. the point is that it allows you to actually write the UI in the same place where your server-side stuff is happening, like database calls and service stuff and things like that. You don't want to mix those two in the same code and the same code path, of course, but still being able to actually do it in one place and let the framework to worry about RPC and rendering and HTML and JavaScript and stuff like that. That can be a huge time saver and even can lead to quite a bit less code as well. I mentioned that it's compromised on scalability, but there's actually a study in our webpage called Quick Ticket, which this movie ticket sales system that we deployed in Amazon in one EC2 large instance, and we were able to run 1,100 concurrent users buying tickets on that one instance. So it's not Facebook or Twitter, of course, but still I think great majority of web applications and especially business applications, they have not nearly enough 1,000 concurrent users. But it's always about compromises. And still, if you like to work with JavaScript, you might be interested to hear that actually we are hard at work at building the same set of UI components for the JavaScript developers. And we are leveraging the rising web component standard for that. So it's based on Polymer, and actually, did you guys actually watch the keynotes from Google I/O a couple of weeks ago? Adam Savage, the product manager for Polymer, actually showcased Vaadin and Vaadin Grid as one of the cool things that people are doing with web components at the moment, and that was really great. And the component set is actually, it's not a set, it's a component at the moment because we started with the hardest one. We took the data grid as the first component that we implemented. And the current version that is out for beta right now, we are pretty happy with it. All kinds of nice features, and we're actually doing advanced stuff as well, like using GPU accelerated scrolling when possible and stuff like that. You can go to vaadin.com/components to learn more. One more thing before we go to actually how Vaadin framework works behind the scenes is that when you are creating an UI, the problem might be that what is considered modern is actually changing all the time. It's not that many years since this glass-like three-dimensional UI style was considered really the best thing ever. I mean, on the style of Windows 7, for example. Then came the really flat look, like Windows Mobile, and now we are shifting back towards a bit more depth and a bit more detail, but in a more subtle way, like what Google is doing at the moment. And the dilemma here is that if you are building an application, it's a business application, a huge application with a big team, it easily may take a year or two before you actually make the first release. How do you actually make sure that your app doesn't look dated on the day it ships? And our solution to that is Valo. Valo is actually the Finnish word for light, but Valo in this case is actually a configurable SaaS-based theme engine, which means that it contains a couple of dozen different parameters, like colors, rounding, shading, and stuff like that. And all the components in Vaadin actually respect those parameters. So it means that if you build your application UI, there are huge amount of views, lots of components in different screens and so forth. Change a couple of those parameters, and all the components that are dependent on those parameters change in a nice, consistent way. So it's really easy to customize the existing application without having to refactor a huge amount of CSS code. You can actually hand keep the CSS as well if you want. Valo is using CSS and vector images, not so much on bitmaps. and this means that the details look quite nice on any resolution and any device. Right, so how does Vaadin framework do its thing? Here is the general structure of a typical web application. So there's a backend, let's say a database, web server that is defining the structure of the UI, like a template or something like that, some RPC, and then JavaScript to actually do the magic. But it's a bit different. There's the database, of course, but the actual RPC and the rendering part can be handled by the framework. So you only need to actually do the UI structure part on the server.java. You can actually extend the RPC and client-side part if you want, and it's quite easy and straightforward, but the power is that it's not necessary. And especially if we ignore the backend, the database is identical in both cases. We can see that actually the amount of stuff you need to do might be quite a bit smaller. And I don't know about you guys, but when it comes to software, in my opinion, simpler is usually better. And final thing about Vaadin before we go into one before final. We have a really nice user base all over the world, and actually I just checked. France is number 10 in the countries sorted by number of users of Vaadin, and we actually have a French board in our discussion forum, so we are trying to make it work for everybody, of course. And the final thing, we didn't want to be one of those open source libraries that have really bad documentation, so we wrote a book. I don't have any hard copy with me, unfortunately, but you can go to the URL and download it for yourself. It contains everything you need to know about Vaadin framework at this point, but we will of course update it with the components and other stuff as well. And this is not the only Vaadin book, there are several third-party books available in Amazon, for example, as well. Alright, so that's theory, that's the basics of what I'm going to talk about. Let's see how it works in practice. I create a simple UI. So I have a couple of classes here, and I'm going to create a new Vaadin UI. Let's not put it in the data package. And when we are creating Vaadin UIs, we will always start by extending the Vaadin UI class. And with the Vaadin UI class, you need to override one method, which is responsible of setting up the UI when the user first time access the UI. And one thing we need to do here is to tell the UI what layout object it should be, the root or the content of the UI. So let's create one. Vertical layout is good. So let's use that, and tell the Null capture. Tell the UI that his layout is the content of the UI. And well, the basic layout exactly doesn't do anything yet, so let's put the label in there. So like a component, new label, and create a login panel. Have the class yet, let's not worry about that quite yet. Let's put it in our layout, and also let's tell the layout that this component should be in the center of the screen. And we can then go like this, and the alignment is middle center. And actually, let's tell the layout to extend to the full screen like that. Alright, and now we need the login view. So let's create a class and let's extend one panel here. Like that. That's fine. And actually one snippet that we can create it from directly. So let's see what's going on here. So first of all, we have a couple of fields. Text field for username, password field, a button you can click, of course, and then a small couple of methods actually show how the login attempt went. And in the constructor here, we are just setting up the UI, a couple of layouts, create the fields, add the fields into the layouts, set up the button, tell the button, this is quite optional, but let's say it's a primary button, it looks nicer, and finally create the status label. Alright, so let's see what happens. Yes, we have a nice looking panel here. Of course, we can type stuff here, we can click the button, but nothing happens because we are just creating the components here and nothing else. Good actually. Can you guys see the backwards what's on the screen? Should I increase the font size? No problem, so let's go with this. Right, so actually we want to do some logic when the user clicks the button. So we could actually put the button click listener here and implement it directly in the view, but that's not really good form, so let's actually use a presenter for that. Create the presenter at the end of the UI layouting. Yes.
You are out of the screen.
The full screen is corrupt, so you don't see everything.
Okay, so I wonder how I can fix that. Maybe like this. Yeah, please say if I scroll it down again. For some reason it's not showing like a error for me. Typically, the view creates the presenter and let's give the presenter actually reference to the view component itself. Right, so we don't again have the presenter, let's create it. That's fine. And create the constructor that gets the view. And in the constructor, the one thing that we want here to do is add a click listener on the button that actually tries to log in with the credentials, and if there are some problems with the credentials, show what's going on in the status label. So it happens by giving a click listener to the button like this, and again I have some code we can use here. Imports. Well, right. So what's going on here is that we get the strings from the UI components, and if the user is explained. And if those pass, try actually use our dummy service. I can actually show you what it does. Really, really simple. Don't do your own guess like this, please. But just a demonstration to see how it might be used from the UI right here. And if the results is not null, then we show a welcome screen, and probably in this part here we want to actually tell the main UI that, okay, take the login panel away and show the actual main UI application. Let's not care about that right now. Alright, so now we have this. Let's reload the screen and see what happens. Let's try clicking the login button. Says the button can, username can't be empty. Password is too short. And give the correct password and it continues me and start showing like this. Alright, so that's the basic idea on how to build gliding UIs. Like that, yes. Alright, next topic. Functional programming. How many of you guys feel that you have a grasp on what's functional programming? The basic techniques and languages and stuff like that? Couple of hands. Okay. That's fine. As I said, I'm going to start with basics, and I'm sure that this is not nearly as complex or difficult that some people make it feel like. It's actually quite straightforward. But before we go into what, let's talk about a bit about why. In my opinion, actually, when we are learning new stuff about programming, about the profession that we are on, we are looking for new ways of thinking about problems. We are looking for new tools to construct new kinds of solutions to those problems and cleaner solutions. And I guess the end goal is kind of write less code that does more. And in my opinion, at least, functional programming is a really, really nice tool for that. And in practice, less code that does more, what does it mean? In practice, it can mean that we can get rid of if checks, we can get rid of loops, or at least transform loops in a form that have a smaller problem surface, I mean less room for bugs, and also in a form that is much easier to run in parallel, because of course that's a good thing considering how the core count is increasing in processors these days. But what really resonates for me at least is that when I'm thinking in functional concepts about my code, I'm trying to tell the language or the computer what I want to happen and not how I want the computer to do it. And an example for the latter thing is, of course, a for loop where I give it, for example, I is from 0 to something, and then I iterate that and then fetch the index and do something with that. Why do I care about the indexes? I usually don't. Sometimes I do, but for the most part that's irrelevant for me. Why do I need to type it for the computer? I just want to tell the computer, this is the collection, do this thing for all the elements, and that's it. I don't care about the details. And if it's easy to make parallel, that's even better. That's totally off my back. I don't need to mess with threads and stuff like that. So, what is functional programming? This is definition of Wikipedia. When I started looking at this a couple of years ago, I thought that okay, that sounds reasonable. I did my time in the university and get around some math. So how hard can it be? So I got excited and started Googling, and really quickly I ran into a huge pile of unfamiliar terms. I can pronounce almost all of them, so that's good, I guess. But it sounds very theoretical. So, and I'm a practical guy. I want to actually make something happen and ship it. let's see if there's something practical about functional programming. First thing I learned is that something called pure functions are really good. You should use them. Pure function basically means that it's a function that only deals in terms of the parameters and returns a return value based on those and doesn't do any side effects. So side effects are bad. But then I was thinking that if side effects are bad and an application is about modifying some state, how do I actually manage my state? Turns out that it's bad, don't do state. And this was me after a couple of Googling sessions. Turns out that my way of trying to tackle this is not really a good way. It's really easy way to get frustrated and dismiss the whole thing as academic nonsense. And I'm not alone, so this is a really representative about. So many people think that very complex and you need a couple of mathematics PhDs to actually be able to do something. But my message to you guys today is that that's wrong. Don't listen to these guys. It's about a couple of quite simple concepts and they are easy to learn. And the best way to start learning about them is actually to start using them. Okay, so what are those concepts? The big one is of course lambdas. And it sounds fancy like many other things in functional programming world, but basically it just means that a function is a first class citizen in the language. Basically you can take a function, store it in a variable, you can pass it as an argument, you can return a function from our function. That's it. It doesn't mean anything else. The rest is just syntax. Many languages, even JVM languages like Scala, Groovy and so forth, they take this to the logical conclusion and they offer function type as a part of the language. I'm working Java 8 today, and Java 8, while it's really nice improvement over Java 7, it actually doesn't take it that far. So let's see. Instead of Java 8 makes us work with something Java 8 calls SAM, which means Single Abstract Method Interface, SAM. So SAM is any interface with exactly one method in it. It doesn't matter what method it is, what parameters the method takes, what it returns, but the count must be exactly one. And if that's true, then the interface is SAM and you can use a lambda for it. One example for a SAM is a runnable interface, which of course has the one method run, which doesn't take any parameters, and their type is void. So this is actually a legal runnable. The parameter is in the parentheses is empty. It doesn't take any parameters and it doesn't return anything. So that's runnable. Second example is a comparator, which has compared to method that takes two objects and does something with them and returns an integer that tells us something about the ordering of those two elements. And I'm sure you can figure out what's going on here. So this is an integer comparator. And you can do the same thing in multiple lines if that's a bit hard for you. But in this case we need return state keyword here. They are basically the same thing otherwise. And UIs actually have quite a bit of SAMs, and the button click listener we just saw is actually one of those. So any event listener usually wants this anonymous class that has one method that actually is handling the event from the UI component. Most of these in any language actually can be used through lambdas. And there's an example of method reference, which means that we don't actually have to keep the lambda implementation in place. We can just tell this that this click listener is this method on this instance. And you can actually use statics as well with the colon notation if you want. One thing I want to point out here is that might notice a distinct lack of types. I'm not giving types here or there. And this is because we are using a really nice feature from Java 8 called type inference, which means that the compiler is actually trying to figure out the types for us, so we don't need to spell them out for it. For example, in the runnable case, well, the compiler knows what the runnable. It knows what the single method in the interface is. It knows it doesn't take in parameters, so this is fine. It doesn't return anything, so print line is fine. Simplifies the code quite a bit. Okay, so we actually had one SAM in our example application. Let's switch our click listener into a Lambda. So this is getting an event, and we don't need this ritual here. And actually one more here, and that's the correct indentation. But basically, that's it. Now I'm giving a Lambda to that click listener. We get to more examples later, but just to demonstrate what's going on. All right. So the next big thing, or the other big thing regarding functional programming are higher order functions. And I want to visualize this, and I did a Google search about what's a higher order function and about this. So this is what you get. Some people really think that higher order functions are really important, and they are, but again, they are not nearly as complex as their fancy name might lead you to think that they are. This is the definition of higher order function. Just a function that can take a function as a parameter, one or more, or return other function as a result. That's it. There's nothing else to it. And so what are those functions that these higher order functions are using and returning? Any ideas? Lambdas, obviously. So that's a really simple conclusion there. And there are two higher order functions that you will be using all the time when you are doing functional stuff. Map and filter. Map is quite simple beast. It operates on a sequence of elements, the upper one there. It takes one parameter, which is a lambda, which basically lambda needs to be able to take one element from the sequence as an input and return something else based on that. That's it. And what the map actually does is that it takes the sequence, calls the lambda for each element in the sequence, and returns you a new sequence that contains the results of those lambda invocations. It doesn't touch the original sequence in any way, and the result will always contain exactly the same amount of elements that the original sequence contains. Quite straightforward in my opinion at least. Second one is filter. It again operates on a sequence, and it takes a lambda that again will take the parameter elements from the sequence, and it will return a true or false based on that element. And what it returns is a new sequence that contains only those elements from the original sequence that the lambda returned true for. It doesn't modify the elements, they actually provide the same object references that were in the original sequence, but well, it filters the sequence. So example, let's say this has this user service with some list of users, and we want to get a username based on the user ID. So first we could convert the user list into a stream, which is a Java 8 version, way to actually be able to use functional stuff. And filter it by user ID. So the matched stream here will only contain users that have this user ID. And if our list is anywhere sane, it will probably contain exactly 1 or 0 elements or users. And then we can actually take that and map that from user into the user name by getting get name for the user there. And it's no longer a stream of users, it's a stream of strings, obviously. Again, probably contains 1 or 0 strings. And then we can just find the first thing from the stream of strings and get it and return it. You can also do a second way to actually do the same thing by chaining the calls. It's a matter of styles. Actually, what happens when you run it is the same. But some people, the first version is easier to read, some people say this is easier to read, I don't know. It's up to you. And really nice thing about higher functions, map and filter and so forth, there are many others as well, that as they don't have any side effects, the language usually provides a really simple way to actually run them in parallel, like maps and filters and stuff like that. So you can utilize your multi-core to actually do the work faster. And you can even, of course, use some actor framework, for example, to distribute the work. If one lambda invocation takes like a second, then you can just push them out to actors in the network and that way make sure that it doesn't take a week to actually execute the call. Alright, so that's what I had on higher functions. Time for the claim web permission. Null checks are code smell. Who thinks this is controversial? Nobody. Come on. So you guys must love null pointer exceptions. Excuse me. Excuse me.
I want to understand.
You don't understand what this means. I mean, who thinks this is wrong? All right. It's right. In Java. Okay. So how do you deal with nulls then? How do you deal with nulls?
I forget and
Yeah, sometimes you forget and then in production boss will not yell to you because there's no pointer exception. And that's of course the reason that people are checking if null or all the time. The code is literally null checks. But I say that the checks are bad. I'm not saying that you shouldn't prepare for them and do something about it. But the point is that this day and age, our tools actually give us much better ways to deal with the problem of a potentially absent value, which is basically what null is. It's a value that doesn't exist. And this is the real way to actually get rid of null pointer exceptions. And the technique that Java 8 gives us is called optional. Here is again some kind of a fictional example of a method that gets users by ID, and instead of just returning user, we are returning optional of user. This means that we will never return null. And this is where we use it. We will call the method and get the optional of user back, and we can just use the isPresent method in optional to see that, okay, was there actually an user in the optional, inside the optional or not. And if this returns true, then we can get the value and, for example, call the name from there. This is actually made possible if you think or consider that optional is actually a collection. It's a collection that can contain 0 or 1 elements. Not anymore, only 1 or 0. And if we actually take this into consideration, this is just a null check in disguise. That's not really useful. Instead, we can just give a lambda to the present and do a side effect, for example, if we want to print the name. It doesn't actually run the lambda if there is no user present in the optional. So that code gets never executed. Totally null safe. We can map the optional, convert it into optional name, let's say. And also we can use or else to give a default value that if you want to pull the value out and if it doesn't exist, then what really concise way to actually do that. Again, there are a couple of ways in our application that we can use this technique. In the service, we are returning a user of null. Let's not do that. So let's instead return an optional of user. Well, and here we can just optional off to return the valid value, and instead of null we will return optional again. So change to our API was quite simple. But again, this will break our presenter because we are no longer getting a result out of here. But what we're actually trying to do is that we want to convert this authentication trial into a message here so that we can show it in the UI. So we can just directly set the value so that since this returns an optional, we can map that user into this string. And this map or lambda will only get called if there is a value, obviously, and finally figure out what happens if there is no value. Then we'll of course just call or else, and in this case just return the application failure. And we can remove this image. This is the same thing, and in my opinion at least, quite a few less places where this can actually break. Time for the last part of the presentation, reactive programming. How many of you guys know what's functional reactive programming? Again, a couple of hands, that's cool. I'm not talking about React.js or something like that. I'm talking about a couple of things here. Basically, the way to bind some result into the source of what's going to be happening in the destination. For example, if there's a value in the UI and there's a database call, instead of just doing the call and doing manually setting the values in the UI, just tell the UI component that your value depends on that and you figure it out. And how this actually in effective works so that if we have a new concept in our toolbox that we can actually build our applications with, value that is changing over time, and another property is important, those values that are changing all the time, they must be composable so that you can combine several of those into new values that are changing over time. If we had that, it's actually possible to rethink the whole UI logic that we're building, or application logic even, in a new way and in an elegant way to actually combine or implement the whole logic as a combination of these values. I guess that I have lost at least some of you at this point. You have no idea what I'm talking about. So there's actually a highly reactive tool that every one of you have been using probably within a week from that. And that's a spreadsheet. If we consider a cell in a spreadsheet, it's a value that's changing over time. It can get new values based on many other things. And also, the cell values are highly composable because you can set the formula into one cell that pulls out values of other cells. And again, other cells have other cells. And the really important here is that we are not putting value change listeners into cells. Let's say when this cell is actually changing, then run this logic to update these and these cells. No, we don't want to do that. We just want to write the formula that says we don't care, or I don't want to know when or how those values there change, but when they do, your value should be that. And this is exactly what the functional programming idea, what instead of how means. So if we can get that kind of way to let the program logic work in this way, in my opinion at least, it's quite powerful in all parts of your code. As a concrete tool, I'm using a tool called Reactive, which is an implementation of .NET concepts built by Microsoft. Originally by Reactive is by Netflix. There are a number of really nice blog posts by Netflix guys that explain why and how they're using and what they're doing with it. But basically it gives us one concept, an observable, that we can get the data from many different sources. And we can combine those observables and then subscribe to those to get the values out of them. And there's also Reactive add-on that actually is a super thin add-on that doesn't do anything else except allows us to wrap body input component like text fields and password fields and stuff like that into observables so that we can actually get a stream of text or text values, for example, from a text field. And this is in practice. So that first we will take an observable string from Rx body value default, and from the name and default value is the string. This basically means that now we have this an observable here that will emit a new string whenever the value of the username text field changes. And we don't need to do anything else. We don't need to subscribe to the text field or anything like that. Reactive actually does that for us. So let's do the same for the password. Good at typing. And the last component actually in our UI is the button. So let's create a observable for that as well, because we don't want to actually run the authentication every time somebody types one character in one text field. Clicks and like that. Alright, now we would actually take the values from those three observables, two strings and one click event, and somehow transform those into a message that we could put into the status label. And so what we want out of it is observable string, let's call it messages, and observable actually gives us this method called combine latest. So basically you can give the several different observables and it will combine the latest values of all of them when some of those changes. So usernames, passwords, clicks, and the last parameter here is a function that will actually take those triplets and combine them into a string. So we don't actually have that right now, so let's make it. It should return a string and get the user and click event, which actually we don't care about. We just want it to be here in this way because so that this will emit a value when the click button is actually clicked. Alright, so we want to take those three values and return a string that is the message for the UI, like this. Code, and last thing is that we can pull out the value from the authentication service. Problem here. And now we have the messages in the observable, and the only thing we need to do is actually tell the label in the UI to follow the value coming out from that observable. And error explaining gives us one trivial method to do that. So status like that. That's right. Here can be empty. And seems to work. And actually interesting thing about this code here is that this is probably not UI logic. This should be in a basic logic class somewhere else, maybe in a server or something. Which means that actually our presenter is 5 lines of code, which is, if you look at those 5 lines, the amount of code that can go wrong, there are 0 checks, there are 0 loops, there are no indexes, there are no variables. If we can reason that every line does it, it's what it's supposed to be doing, then there's basically no room for bugs here. And this is what I think is quite interesting about applying this functional reactive actually, the last part of my presentation, thanks for this opportunity to talk to you guys. And one thing I want to mention that if you guys are interested, we are looking for talented developers to our headquarters in Finland and Berlin as well. But thank you. Body framework and almost all of our tools are Apache licensed, so they are free for anything. And you can find the source code from GitHub. Any other questions? We have a couple of minutes, I think. Yes?
Just look, it's still usually based on bit.
Yes, the rendering engine that actually one uses to put stuff on screen and client side. We have written that using GWT, but actually the components and stuff like that, they have nothing to do with it. So we are using it as a part of the chain, and if you are doing client side extensions in your environment application, then you might be using Quit to actually build those, but no Quit knowledge required. Any other questions? Okay, so that's it. Thank you again.
Thank you.